It started with a single tweet from a European banker, and within 48 hours the bond market exploded. Venezuela, the world's largest oil reserve, was no longer a nation but $17 trillion in distressed collateral. Wall Street did not send diplomats. The United States sent warships. This was not an invasion. This was a global foreclosure, engineered so precisely that Venezuelan bonds shot up 400% overnight. Stripped of politics and pretense, a new era of asset seizure by military muscle had arrived. And as the smoke settled, the next name on the liquidation list was already echoing across the Middle East. Why would a banker's signal unleash war? What happens when the world's most valuable choke points become bargaining chips? The truth behind the foreclosure and who profits next is finally about to be told. On January 7th, 2026, a message appeared online from a man whose family name has moved markets for centuries. The words were simple: the path to restructuring is now open. The world did not need an explanation. The timestamp was enough. At that moment, Venezuela's fate was not decided by a general, a president, or a judge. It was decided on a balance sheet. The numbers behind the headline are cold and blunt. Venezuela sits on top of roughly 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than any other country on Earth. Multiply that by the current benchmark price of $57 a barrel, and you get $17 trillion. Not in gold, not in cash, but in black, heavy crude. That is not a national identity, that is collateral. For a decade, Venezuela's oil had been locked away, trapped by sanctions, mismanagement, and a mountain of unpaid debt. Over $150 billion in external obligations, bonds, arbitration awards, and Chinese loans were stacked against the country with no path to repayment. Creditors circled like sharks. The only thing more valuable than the oil itself was the certainty that someone, anyone, could finally take control of it. That is what the message provided. Not hope, not freedom, but certainty. The market does not care about speeches or promises. It cares about who holds the keys. In a single instant, the world's largest untapped oil reserve was no longer a sovereign prize. It was an asset ready for liquidation, and every trader, banker, and lawyer understood what that meant. The numbers did not lie. $17 trillion on the table, waiting to be claimed. The only question left was who would get paid and who would get wiped out. Bond traders did not wait for a press conference. The instant the restructuring signal hit, Venezuelan bonds, dead paper for nearly a decade, came roaring back to life. On trading screens in New York, London, and Zurich, prices for the 2027 and 2031 notes shot up as much as 400% within hours. This was not a rally, it was a feeding frenzy. For years, these bonds had been written off as toxic, trading for pennies on the dollar, haunted by court battles and frozen assets. Then, overnight, they became golden tickets. The only thing that changed was certainty. Not about politics, not about humanitarian reform, but about who would control the asset and enforce the claim. The chart tells the story better than any speech. The spike does not track with elections or speeches. It tracks with the moment the world's most infamous creditors got the green light. BlackRock, Vanguard, Rothschild, their committees had been circling Venezuela's carcass for years, waiting for a trigger. Now the trigger had been pulled. The market did not care about the faces on the balcony. It cared about the legal paperwork, the signatures on the restructuring term sheets, the court orders that would let a new management team sell the oil and pay the coupon. In the eyes of the bond market, Venezuela was not a country. It was a non-performing loan finally moving to collection. The rules were simple. Whoever controlled the asset got paid. Every lawyer and banker in the game understood the choreography. The repo team moves in, the collateral is secured, the creditors get their pound of flesh. The market does not react to justice, it reacts to certainty. And when certainty arrived, the price went vertical. That is how you know the eviction is real. Oil is not just oil. Venezuelan crude is a different animal entirely. thick as molasses, dark as tar, carrying a chemical signature that makes most refineries in the world throw up their hands. It clocks in at an API gravity of 8 to 10 degrees. For comparison, West Texas Intermediate, the gold standard of American light crude, sits at 39 to 40. API gravity is a measure of how heavy or light a petroleum liquid is compared to water. The lower the number, the heavier the oil. Venezuelan crude does not float, it sinks. That's just the beginning of the problem. Sulfur content in this oil runs between 2 and 4%. In the oil world, that is considered sour, not a flavor but a warning label. High sulfur eats through pipelines, poisons catalysts, and turns into acid rain if you burn it without proper treatment. Most refineries, especially those in Europe and Asia, are built for sweet light grades, easy to process, low on contaminants, high on profit. Venezuelan oil is the opposite. It is dirty, dense, and stubborn. Turning this sludge into gasoline or jet fuel requires something special, the coker unit. These are industrial monsters, steel towers bristling with pipes and valves, designed to crack heavy molecules under intense heat and pressure. The coker does more than refine oil, it breaks it down, cooks out the sulfur, and leaves behind a pile of petroleum coke, essentially industrial coal. Without a coker, Venezuelan crude is almost worthless. With one, it becomes a gold mine. Only a handful of places on Earth have the machinery to handle this kind of feedstock at scale. The Gulf Coast of the United States is littered with these steel cathedrals built decades ago for one purpose: to turn Venezuela's geological headache into an industrial jackpot. That is the lock. The oil and the machinery are two halves of a code, and only the right combination can unlock the value. On the Gulf Coast, oil refineries stand like armored vaults, built not for beauty, but for brute chemical force. Motiva's Port Arthur complex in Texas processes 600,000 barrels a day. ExxonMobil's Baytown plant processes more than 500,000 barrels a day. Valero's Behemoth at Port Arthur, Marathon's Galveston Bay refinery, and Phillips 66 in Lake Charles are each fortresses of pipes and towers, engineered for a single purpose: to break the back of heavy crude. These are not generic factories. They are custom-built to handle the thick sulfur-loaded output from Venezuela's Orinoco Belt. Decades ago, American engineers rewired these plants with coker units, hydrocrackers, and desulfurization trains, an industrial arms race just to process the world's dirtiest oil at scale. The rest of the world never bothered. In China, the refineries at Dalian and Zhuhai were designed for Middle Eastern blends, medium-sweet crudes that flow like water and need little coaxing. When Beijing poured $60 billion into Venezuela's oil fields, they bought the reserves, but not the right machinery. Shipments of Orinoco crude clogged their systems, overwhelmed their limited cokers, and forced operators to flare off barrels by the millions. The chemistry just did not match. Chinese engineers tried to retrofit, but the economics collapsed. Billions vanished into the mud, and the oil kept piling up, unrefined, unsold, and useless. On the Gulf, it is a different story. Every barrel of Venezuelan sludge is a perfect fit for the machinery. The oil and the plants were designed for each other, a lock and key forged by decades of trade, politics, and necessity. This is not just about geology or engineering, it is about control. Whoever holds the Gulf Coast refineries controls the only real market for Venezuela's reserves. Without access to these steel cathedrals, the world's largest oil stockpile is a stranded asset. With them, it is a $17 trillion payday. That is why the seizure was not just a military operation. It was an industrial reunification, the asset and the machine finally back on the same balance sheet. Venezuela's debt ledger reads like a warning label for sovereign risk. By 2026, the country had racked up more than $150 billion in arrears, an amount that dwarfs its annual GDP and outpaces the reserves of most central banks. This figure is not just a headline, it is a constraint that shapes every negotiation, every policy, every move on the chessboard. The bulk of this debt sits in New York law bonds, governed by strict contracts that treat every creditor equally, pari passu. That clause is a razor blade. If one bondholder gets paid, all of them must. There is no room for favorites, no backroom deals to cut out the sharks circling the Caracas. $150 billion is not a single loan or a tidy stack of IOUs. It is a web of obligations, defaulted bonds, arbitration rulings, and bilateral loans, each with its own army of lawyers and claims. Hedge funds, pension plans, European banks, and Chinese state lenders all have skin in the game, but not all claims are created equal. Some are secured by barrels of oil, others by the hope of a future government willing to pay. The legal machinery is relentless. Every contract, every clause, every footnote becomes a potential weapon in the fight for repayment. This is the landscape creditors operate in. A country with the world's largest oil reserves, but with its hands tied behind its back by the fine print of international finance. The size of the debt is not just a measure of what is owed, it is the leverage that sets the stage for what comes next. Before anyone can talk about restructuring, asset seizures, or odious debt, the market has to reckon with the sheer scale of the claim. $150 billion is not a rounding error. It is the opening bid in a global auction. The doctrine has a name, whispered in law offices and creditor meetings: odious debt. It is the oldest trick in the foreclosure playbook. When a regime collapses, the new management claims that certain debts, especially those owed to rivals, were taken on by the dictator for personal gain, not for the nation. That is the legal loophole. The debts to China, built on oil for loan deals and handshake agreements with Maduro's circle, are painted as illegitimate, tainted by corruption and backroom favors. Western bondholders, on the other hand, have contracts governed by New York law, signed and notarized, with every clause designed to survive a regime change. The lawyers move fast. Within days, the new government files a motion to repudiate the Chinese claims, citing the odious debt doctrine first used by United States courts after the Spanish-American War. The argument is simple. Those loans were never for the people. They were for the dictator. The court nods. The Chinese claims are wiped from the books. The oil that was once collateral for Beijing is now free to be sold to the highest bidder. Meanwhile, Western creditors watch their positions transform from junk status to prime real estate. The foreclosure metaphor becomes literal. The sheriff changes the locks, tosses out the old tenant's furniture, and hands the keys to the bank that wrote the original mortgage. In this game, the winners are the ones who wrote the rules, and the losers are left holding a contract that is suddenly worth nothing at all. The operation had a name that would never appear in a press release: light switch. The doctrine was simple: flip the power off, flip the regime over, and leave the infrastructure untouched. No massed armor, no rolling columns, just a series of coordinated cyber strikes that took Venezuela's grid offline in the dead of night. Air defenses, communications, even refinery controls were silent. By the time the first helicopters crossed the perimeter, Caracas was already in the dark. The only lights burning were in the control rooms of the US Navy's cyber teams, watching the country's nervous system go quiet. Within 47 hours, the job was finished. Maduro was in custody, his entourage scattered. Not a single oil field was set ablaze, not a refinery sabotaged. The old playbook, scorched earth and block-by-block fighting, never came off the shelf. The new playbook looked more like a foreclosure than a war. Secure the asset, change the locks, hand the keys to the new management. The only casualties were the illusions about sovereignty. This was not a demonstration of overwhelming force. It was a demonstration of overwhelming competence. The operation was designed to protect the collateral, not destroy it. An entire country's industrial backbone was preserved for the next owner. Russian generals spend years grinding down cities and losing tanks by the thousand. The liquidation team did it in 2 days, with the lights off and the pipelines intact. The message was not lost on anyone watching from Tehran. 20% of the world's oil flows through a single bottleneck, the Strait of Hormuz. On one side, the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas. On the other, the Emirati terminal at Fujairah. Every supertanker that leaves the Persian Gulf, bound for Shanghai, Rotterdam, or Houston, must thread this narrow channel. The map doesn't care about ideology, it cares about physics. Whoever controls Hormuz controls the global oil supply. That is not a metaphor. It's a risk multiplier written in tanker manifests and insurance premiums. Iran is not just a country, it is the landlord of the world's most valuable shipping lane. The strait is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but it moves more money every day than most national economies. Block it, and crude prices don't spike, they detonate. Every refinery from Louisiana to Guangdong would feel the shock. Every central banker in New York, London, and Beijing would scramble to recalculate the odds of recession. The logic that liquidated Venezuela doesn't stop at the Caribbean. It follows the oil, the pipes, the paperwork. Iran's leverage is not its missiles or its proxies. It's the geography, the choke point that keeps the world's engines running. The repo team has already shown what happens when an asset becomes a liability. And in the eyes of the balance sheet, Hormuz is the ultimate asset, sitting on a hair trigger. The risk is not theoretical. It's waiting in the shipping lanes, measured in barrels and days. Today, the world's largest oil reserves and vital shipping lanes are no longer just geopolitical prizes, they are collateral. As the US refines its model of asset seizure, global markets watch for the next trigger. The new era isn't about flags or ideologies, it's about who controls the receipts. The next notification could redraw the map. What is your take? Drop your thoughts in the comments.